Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. Welcome to the post-election edition of Drezburt. I'm Daniel Drezner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I write spoiler alerts for the Washington Post.
Good morning. I'm Heather Hurlburt. I run New Models of Policy Change at New America. And I think the first thing that's important to say is I can't see Professor Drezner, but I at least still have all my hair. So we're here. We haven't torn out our hair. We're still talking to each other. The world has not yet ended. Deep breaths.
I would always talk to you, Heather. I mean, no matter what. Let's get that off. You know, nothing's going to change that.
So we thought, in an effort of sort of modeling the kind of accountability that we want to see in the world, this is the what we got wrong and what we got right, mea culpa to you, the viewers edition.
That is correct. So I guess I have to start.
You like how I did that?
Yeah, it was very good of you. I mean, the most obvious thing I got wrong was that I did not think Donald Trump was going to either win the GOP nomination or I was skeptical that he was going to win the presidential campaign. I will mildly defend myself and say that one of the advantages of reading people like Nate Silver and Sean Trende was that I thought there was a 1 in 3 chance of Trump winning. You know, if you recall the weekend before the election, there was all this criticism. I think Ryan Grimm of the Huffington Post actually wrote an article arguing that Nate Silver was stacking the deck in favor of Trump's odds, which was mildly absurd. I was convinced it could happen, but I think what I most badly underestimated was the degree to which normal campaign logic did not apply this year. You know, throughout the entire arc of the campaign, one of the things I argued was that Trump's surrogates on television were just awful, that they did not really make much sense and that they were not of high quality. Trump had no real policy expertise to speak of. Indeed, by all reports, he shuttered his policy shop in August. And while I don't think policy is the only thing that decides an election, I do think that it can affect people, certainly. And then finally, I thought that in the end, you know, voters would take a look at Donald Trump's temperament as displayed throughout the campaign and decide that this is not a man who should be entrusted with the nuclear codes. And if the exit polls are accurate, and let me stress I have no idea if the exit polls are accurate, there is a fair amount of evidence, as Jack Schaefer, I think, argued at Politico, that the American people actually pretty much processed all this stuff. It's not that they denied that this was true. A majority of Americans are suspicious of Donald Trump's temperament, don't necessarily trust Donald Trump, but there was a significant fraction of those people who said, I'm still going to vote for him anyway. And so that was the thing that I underestimated. And I clearly overestimated things like Hillary Clinton's get out the vote operation. I thought that in the end, the fact that she was better organized on the ground would lead to maybe a 1 or 2% bump in how she did compared to the state-level polling in the battleground states, and the exact opposite occurred, that her support was much less robust.
Yeah, so my mea culpa is that there are, in looking now, a number of places where sort of some fundamentals did hold, or some things that we knew were true, and I feel that I am quite guilty of having seen things that I should have known to be true and just assuming or deciding that they weren't true. Thing number one is the turnout issue, and this, this is where I think I have to plead guilty to living in the bubble. And I definitely did not understand that, half of our fellow citizens didn't feel like bothering to vote. The turnout figures. 49% of public didn't vote, 25.6% voted for Clinton, 25.5% voted for Trump. So I think Donald Trump got fewer votes than either Mitt Romney or John McCain did. Yes. And Clinton got, 6 million fewer votes than Obama did? Am I at 6 million or 6%? I'm sorry. I apologize, viewers. It's been a low sleep week. But I totally missed that enthusiasm gap. Although, again, if I had been more able to take seriously the sort of these are the two worst candidates ever, which, because obviously that isn't my personal view, I discounted the number of times it got written. So that's, I think, mistake number one I made. Mistake number two, we know that the American public hates third terms, that it's very difficult for any party to win a third term. And the way that kind of fundamental of American politics expresses itself is in this sort of more of the same. She's not a change candidate. She doesn't have any new ideas. She didn't have a vision. Again, all of which things I sort of heard, and I thought, well, all of that's not true. But it's expressing, this kind of fundamental truth about American politics. And I got to say, I just brushed right on over that one. And then the third thing that happened that I am really kicking myself about, because I wrote a couple of articles about this in 2014 and 2015. And
I know where you're going with
yeah.
it.
So in 2014, the Republicans, with Kellyanne Conway as one of the architects of this, ran some really rather clever, although I would argue quite destructive, campaigns in which they used a series of ads really scaring voters on national security issues, sometimes in quite ridiculous ways. You remember the Hezbollah fighters infected with Ebola that ISIS was going to send into the U.S.? And we laughed at that, but everybody who ran those ads won, with the exception of Scott Brown. So, that strategy worked, and I think that it works in two ways. One is that it pulls white women back to the Republican candidate, and two is it discourages turnout. And
right.
I thought
this goes back to the.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, Joshua Green and Sasha Issenberg, I think, wrote a great piece in Bloomberg about 2 weeks ago about Trump's data operation, where part of the element of that is that there was a conscious strategy by the Trump media team to put out ads with the idea. Suppressing is the wrong word. It was to depress. He used the quote was suppressed, but it's actually depressed. In other words,
right? Because suppress implies legal tactics. You're saying,
right? And that's not or illegal tactics.
Agree.
That's not what they were saying. What they were saying is they wanted to put out negative ads about Clinton that would depress the turnout of her demographics, namely African Americans, minorities, other voters who might otherwise have been inclined to vote for Clinton.
Yep. And number one, we all missed that was happening. And number two, because it was coming out of the mouth of Trump and seemed so ridiculous, it just didn't occur to me. It didn't occur to me that it was happening or that it could work. And in fact, my colleagues at New America and I talked about this, and Mark Schmidt wrote a piece, but I take responsibility for this point of view as well, saying, oh, look, Kellyanne Conway is presiding over the dismantling of the coalition of Republican women that she helped assemble. But in fact, Clinton got the same proportion of white women that Obama got against Romney. And because I know there's a piece in Time today about how women deserted Clinton, blah, blah, I actually think, I'm just going to pivot a little here, it's very important to say that specifically, black women came home to Clinton over 90%, just amazing numbers. I haven't seen a breakdown for Latino women, white women, as I said, it was about the same, although that's very broken out by education. Clinton won white women with college degrees. And interestingly, she lost non-college men by almost 50 points, non-college white men by almost 50 points. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, her support among black men was 10 points lower than Obama's was. So you can see
same with Latinos, if memory serves.
There were certain places where this set of very gendered and very related to national security, to our issues, set of tactics really worked against her, and we all saw them happening, and I certainly didn't perceive that they were happening.
No, I think that's fair. The only thing I will say, this isn't a defense per se, but again, it is worth stressing the degree to which the actual outcome did not just surprise Democrats, but I would argue also surprised Republicans, including Trump's campaign. My understanding is that from the second part of the Green and Issenberg study is that Trump's own data team only gave him a 30% chance of winning on Tuesday, which suggests that this was a legitimate surprise, not for partisan reasons, but literally because the data didn't necessarily support the argument that Trump was actually going to get more votes.
Yeah, and the other thing that I think is terribly hard and that I'm finding terribly frustrating is that it's a very normal thing, both to want to learn lessons from what happened, which is a charitable way of putting it, and also to want to assign blame. And you're sort of seeing a lot of both going around. But at a certain point, this is so weirdly overdetermined, because you can decide to blame Jill Stein and Gary Johnson. You can decide to blame the 110,000 people who didn't vote the top of the ticket in Michigan, which is a fascinating phenomenon. You can decide to blame, some of the demographic shifts I just referenced. You can decide to blame voter suppression, actual voter suppression in North Carolina, where African American turnout was down 5%, right. And it does seem like some unknowable chunk of that was people who would have liked to vote. So I'm almost, again, I go back to fundamental number one: the public hates third terms. And I'm also going to say here, as much as I am devastated by this result, and it is bad for America, and it is bad for lots of individual human beings, the public is not wrong to hate third terms in the abstract. I do got to say that.
No. There's a valid reason for why you want changes in the executive branch. This country has a lot of liberals, has a lot more conservatives, and you need to have some degree of turnover in the executive branch. That's not an unhealthy thing.
Yeah. So I want to pivot, Dan, though, to something where you and I, what's an interest? I mean, I think we can both claim that we were right, which is actually kind of a nice sort of kumbaya moment. In every Blogging Heads we've done this season, we've talked about the Never Trump movement among Republicans, and who would renege off that movement. And I've been quite cynical and said all along that people would, and you've been quite hopeful and said all along that people wouldn't. And now here we are, and it looks like we were both right in that actually. The Republican intellectuals, Republican foreign policy intellectuals specifically, were really kind of the last people standing, and still out there very publicly, right up to and on Election Day and Election Night, very publicly making clear their opposition. I mean, I'm thinking of people like Max Boot and yourself and Bob Kagan, Corey Shockey at Stanford.
Yeah.
At the same time, it is clear now you have, people sort of lining up. I mean, there was a very interesting quote from Lanhee Chen, who was Romney's policy advisor, who I don't believe was ever a never Trumper, but
no, he wasn't. Basically, to be fair. And he's not used, and he's not really a foreign policy guy,
basically used Politico to advertise his availability to the Trump administration. So you now not only have sort of a big whisper game in Washington about who's going in, who's already talking to them, but you also now, it's starting to come out that there were some people who sort of went over in September and October and said, somebody better be talking to them.
So, I think Brian McGrath, who along with Elliot Cohen was the architect for a lot of the Never Trump, the original Never Trump national security letter. As McGrath pointed out, I think that the letter made it clear that the idea was, we will not help Trump during the campaign. We do not think he is the right choice for president. I don't think the letter precluded anyone from deciding after that they would necessarily go into, if Trump won, do you go into an administration then? I think there's a number of issues here. The first and most important one is whether Donald Trump will actually, or Trump's transition team is going to want to hire any of these people. Trump prizes loyalty above almost everything, is my understanding from everything I've read about and heard about him during this campaign. So, the Never Trump movement is literally an expression of disloyalty in that sense. It would be understandable if the Trump team did not necessarily want to hire that many people. On the other hand, there's every little bit of evidence that's coming out suggests that, as I said, the Trump team themselves did not think they were going to win. And because they did not think they were going to win, they probably are far further behind in terms of transition team planning than, let's say, the Clinton team, which I assume had pretty much a blueprint in place to start the day after Election Day.
That's correct.
To know what they were going to do. So as a result, Trump's team is already playing catch-up on this, even only 48 hours after the election. Now, to be fair, all transitions are rocky. All transitions have bumps in the road. Obama's did. George W. Bush's did, Bill Clinton's did, even George H.W. Bush's from Ronald Reagan's did. So that's not entirely surprising. The unique problem in the Trump case is was there's two of them, which is you have to hire people to fill certain positions. And we're not talking about cabinet level positions. We're talking about sub-cabinet positions. Assistant secretaries of state, deputy assistant secretaries of state. You need political appointees. And as you pointed out, the foreign policy community was pretty much, implacably opposed to Donald Trump for a variety of reasons, including what Donald Trump said about foreign policy during the campaign. So I don't think Trump will have any difficulty finding or picking cabinet level positions. I mean, he's had a few loyalists. The question is what's going to happen, at the second, the deputy level, the assistant secretary level, the staffing level.
Yeah, and there are a couple things that I think are worth pointing out, that now that he has won, as soon as sort of word gets around what the address is, his transition team will be deluged by resumes from people in industry, people in academia. Honestly, this is one of the things that I think we all need to learn out of this experience. We in the Beltway and Beltway connected national security community tend to think that we're more irreplaceable than we may in fact be. So I wouldn't, I've seen some kind of, the government will ground to a halt because he won't be able to hire assistant secretaries. Well, no. Now, what may happen is that they won't be able to get people clearances. And so, given, the huge problems, some of its own making, but not all of its own making, that the Obama administration has had in filling positions, even unconfirmed positions in a timely manner, you could imagine a scenario where the Trump people, or I should say the cabinet level appointees, actually have to go and say, look, some of you, please don't leave because we can't replace you.
It would not surprise me if that, and to be fair, if memory serves, when Obama came in 2008, there were a few Bush appointees who were asked to stay, not beyond Bob Gates, obviously, but there were sub-cabinet people who were asked to hang around for a while until the confirmation process.
And that, in fact, is a fairly normal thing that happens in a transition, friendly or hostile. The other point that I think is worth making, and then maybe we can transition to gossiping about cabinet appointments a little bit, is that you do have some names being tossed around for big national security jobs that are pretty well respected. And so it'll get a lot easier for people, I think, if instead of saying I'm going to work for Donald Trump, you say, well, I'm going to work for Steve Hadley, or I'm going to work for Bob Corker. And then, of course... So there's a flip side to that, which is, you're right, there are some names that if they are... I think this is actually going to be the crucial variable to determine the degree to which you have sort of the traditional GOP foreign policy apparatus decide to go work for this administration, which is the names you just threw out, Steve Hadley and Bob Corker. These people are generally respected inside the Beltway. They have reputations of being, competent foreign policy people, or people who care about the issue, if nothing else. You're right. I could see a fair number of people deciding they want to go work for those people. Then on the other hand, there's John Bolton, who has also been bandied about to be Secretary of State. There is Michael Flynn, who I assume is going to wind up being National Security Advisor. These people certainly also have resumes that would suggest they can be confirmed and so forth. Their reputations are slightly different, though. And in some ways, I think you're correct that the cabinet appointments, in some ways, will be a powerful signal not just of what you will be asked to do if you serve in a Trump administration, but literally what are the policies of the Trump administration going to be? Does Donald Trump, tell South Korea and Japan, you should absolutely get nuclear weapons now because we're going to be scaling back? Or does he not do that? Does he tell NATO, you need to ramp up your security contributions, otherwise, you can forget the Article 5 commitment, or does that not happen? Well, look, I'm going to step in and play the let's not scaremonger role here.
No, I don't mean to scaremonger.
But look,
it's unclear.
Let's be clear. Trump called South Korea's president and said, he was committed to the security guarantee. He called the prime minister of Japan. He's made, 10 calls? It was, the Brits are freaking...
I think he's talked to Justin Trudeau as well.
Yeah. And the Brits are freaking out because I gather he called Ireland before he called London. I'm not totally sure I have that right. But anyway, Theresa May was reported to have been number 9 on the list, which is going to... which is, and there, sort of, this brings me to my next point. That's an interesting bit of, I mean, it's a little more extreme than I think a Democrat would have done. But, the extent to which Barack Obama has repeatedly signaled to the UK, look, the special relationship doesn't replace relationships with the rest of the world, and that he was repeatedly criticized by one wing of the Republican foreign policy establishment for not understanding the special relationship. I mean, he was criticized in pretty racialized terms, actually, about that, which brings me back to Hadley and Corker. Hadley and Corker are very well-respected members of the Republican national security establishment, but neither of them is from the more hawkish end of it. Both of them, in fact, are considered to be, how can I put this, if not sympathetic to the Iran nuclear deal, at least not interested in blowing it up for the sake of blowing it up.
Not implacably opposed, given that the deal is in existence.
Corker let it go through, ultimately.
Yeah.
And Hadley, in the second Bush term could have, I mean, the second Bush term looked at the options with respect to Iran and decided not to push very hard on the military side. So it's interesting.
And furthermore, vetoed an Israeli proposal for them to hit
as we now know. So I want to be clear. I'm not trying to say, oh, this isn't that bad. There's a lot of angst. There's a lot of angst among Democrats right now, sort of divided, that the risk that if you say, oh, we all need to sort of man up and work with him, that is selling out the people who are most afraid and vulnerable right now. So I want to stress, I'm not saying that, but we are going to see, imagining cabinet meetings with Corker and Hadley on one side of the room and Bolton and Gingrich on the other. That, and I also noticed that there's supposedly already internal fighting about who's going to be chief of staff, but
right, Steve Bannon or Reince
that is going to be a hell of a fight for somebody to referee, and I just purely as a human being, I
have great faith that Ivanka Trump will be will make the right decision.
Oh, I am careful there. I actually would not doubt Ivanka's ability to bang heads if necessary.
No, I was being sarcastic.
But I do, like, again, these what I think you could end up having is actually a foreign policy that does look more like Republican restraint, punctuated by fits of irrational exuberance.
Well, let me put it this way. First of all, I want to be clear. I wasn't trying to scaremonger before. I was just trying to say that we have a lot of Donald Trump's rhetoric on the campaign, and we honestly don't know what is going to wind up being implemented and what won't be. I would suggest that if it winds up, I think there's one of two ways this can play out. If, as it turns out, Trump appoints Michael Flynn to be his national security advisor, but then employs, as you say, Hadley and Corker at Defense and State, I think you're going to see, basically a replay of what has happened in previous Republican administrations when you actually had a weak chief executive. Which is to say the first term of Bush's administration, George W. Bush's administration, and to some extent the second term of Ronald Reagan's, which is there's going to be a lot of bureaucratic infighting because Michael Flynn and John Bolton are not wallflowers in this sense. They're going to have strong opinions. Hadley and Corker might have strong opinions, and I think you're going to see a lot of bureaucratic set-tos in that sense.
I'm going to interrupt you there for viewers who may not remember this, but in August 2001. Washington was buzzing with how ineffective the Bush administration was, how there were big scandals and messes at the Pentagon that Rumsfeld was not able to cope with, that everybody was fighting all the time, that the team was really ineffective. So I find... Indeed,
I think there was a story that came out on September 11th, in Time, I want to say, speculating that Donald Rumsfeld was going to retire.
Yeah, so I find that comparison is fascinating and also terrifying, frankly, because, of course, the world doesn't just let you alone to have your infighting.
Right. The alternative, by the way, is that it's not Hadley and Corker, that it winds up being people like John Bolton and Jeff Sessions who wind up taking the top cabinet positions, in which case you actually do have a more ideologically unified cabinet, but one that is going to pursue foreign policies that might be perceived as somewhat more problematic, let's say. I would describe it as sort of unilaterally hawkish. And we will see how this goes. The truth is, we don't know at this point. We honestly don't know who's going to get those cabinet level positions. And I think the biggest known unknown is the extent to which Donald Trump himself winds up being the adjudicator, or how much does he delegate. If I had to bet, I would assume he's going to delegate as much as humanly possible. All the evidence suggests he doesn't have the attention span to handle these kinds of things. And he doesn't want to read the necessary briefings to be able to do these things. But I'm willing to have my mind changed on that.
So another point that is relevant here is that historically, first-term presidents usually want to do their domestic priorities first, and I see no reason to think Trump would be any different.
And I think there was a report yesterday that in his meeting with the Hill, that his top 3 priorities that he listed were, I want to say, border security, taxes, and infrastructure. And the border security is to some extent foreign policy, but not the way he's thinking of it. And so in that sense, foreign policy will be on the back burner.
Yeah. So there, but the other side of that is that traditionally first-term presidents are very much led by their national security advisor and their secretary of state. So then you circle back to the appointments. The other thing I wanted to say, though, is that one can easily imagine, specifically the repeal and replace Obamacare, taking up something close to the amount of time and energy that actual Obamacare did in Obama's first term. In which case there's just not a lot of bandwidth left anywhere for major foreign policy activity. And I think that that dramatically affected what Obama got done on foreign policy his first term. There's the famous Rahm Emanuel quote about Gitmo, don't bother me with your flock of Canada geese while I'm trying to land a 747. I think there were a few F-bombs in that sentence when Rahm originally said it. But you think about how complicated it's going to be for and how many of the divisions within the Republican Party it's going to lay bare to try to come up with something that keeps the parts of Obamacare that are popular, especially popular with the voters who turned out and won this election for Republicans up and down the ticket, and satisfy the fiscal hawks in the Republican Party, because, by the way, the parts that are popular are the expensive parts.
Can I just say, let me interject you here. This is the worst, as I understand it, fiscal hawks are going to be the big losers in this campaign, because there is every evidence to suggest that, the fact that Trump mentioned infrastructure spending as his, on the in his victory speech, the fact that, there is much greater enthusiasm in the GOP for tax cuts than necessarily fiscal probity. I'm assuming the deficit's going to explode.
So I'm going to make a prediction here. I didn't even repent for 20 minutes before I started making new predictions. Look at me.
I like the idea of a pundits anonymous, by the way. Notion of, hi, my name's Dan. I haven't made a prediction. It's been 20 minutes since my last political prediction. I'm feeling good. But I want to do it. I want it. Exactly. It's hard. I read the news and I keep wanting to make those predictions, and it feels so good to make those predictions. And then you do one, and then you do another, and then you do a third one, and then you're really rolling, and then you're fantasizing about being on television, and then it turns out you're wrong again. You're just wrong again, and then you're sobbing in front of your laptop as you're reading. That was eerily easy to do. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Does that feel good?
Yes, exactly.
So I will make a few observations rather than...
observations, yes.
The Republicans who are coming back to Congress, we will have lost a few of the more establishment-y types, and where there are new Republicans, they tend to be less establishment-y types.
Which is a trend that's been going on for the last 10 years.
I'm kind of eschewing the Tea Party label, and I haven't really seen another good label yet. But while the Republican base, I think, demonstrated that it doesn't care as much about fiscal restraint as it does about things that it likes, you are still electing a non-trivial number of members of Congress who care intensely about fiscal restraint and who, while some of them are going to feel very indebted to Donald Trump for saving their bacon and bringing them to D.C. or back to D.C., there's a whole other swath that don't feel even slightly indebted to him. And the question that I will pose as an interesting question rather than a prediction is how long victory is a good disciplinarian and keeps those folks in line, and how long it is before some proposal causes them to rebel. And my read is that could be anywhere between 3 months and 3 years.
It's a valid question, and we don't know. I mean, the other thing is the degree to which expectations will have shifted because of the way the election, played out, which is the fact is the Republicans now control the Senate, the House, and the presidency. In these circumstances, you expect stuff to get done. In the same way that Obama, when in his first 2 years of office, got a fair amount accomplished legislatively, because all three, the legislative and executive branches were controlled by the same party. So the thing that remains legitimately unknown, I think, is to what extent does Trump's voters, what will it take for Trump's voters to turn on him? And here I actually think it's a legitimately an open question, because on the one hand you can argue that a fair number of them are obviously fiercely loyal to the man himself, and can explain away a lot of what he does. But Donald Trump remains the most unpopular major party nominee in history, and there were a fair number of people who voted for him that clearly don't like him very much. And so one wonders if, as it turns out, things don't get done, do you see those voters, get disgusted and decide, okay, you had your chance and that's it, which would lead to potential changes in the, and pressure on Republican incumbents or the Republican Party in the midterms, and then obviously in 2020. But I have to think there is a political argument to be made that if you are Trump, and certainly if you're the White House staff, you want spending to go up, because it will politically sell, because those are the things that voters notice. For lack of a better way of putting it. So I don't deny that fiscal hawks have some seniority in Congress. I don't think, let me put it this way, do you think that Paul Ryan comes out of this election stronger or weaker?
Yes.
Fair enough.
No, because on the one hand, he was able to survive, but everybody saw what happened, how he survived. And, it's now, I think, everyone thinks he serves at Trump's pleasure. And if it's perceived that, right now, the threat of a challenge seems to have melted away. But it's not as if anyone thinks anymore that he has a strong independent base.
Right.
That he can go back to. So, the irony of this is that he is now going to have to prove he can deliver that caucus with a whole lot of people looking over his shoulder, and that is not an easy thing to do. So, I mean, on the one hand...
No, it's an awful job.
And on the one hand, I mean, it's hard not to say he comes out stronger because he's been looking so catastrophically weak for, 10 months now? But this is a hell of a way to come out stronger, I mean, it's going to be... And I should also add, just while we're talking sort of personalities on the Hill, the Democrats switch out Harry Reid for Chuck Schumer. And there you actually switch from a more restrained set of views on national security to a more interventionist set of views on national security. So that'll be interesting. And then you're going to have ferocious infighting everywhere else, and a bunch of new folks coming in who, to greater or lesser degree, either don't have foreign policy views or have foreign policy views that they very carefully kept to themselves. So, you right now, for example, this crazy idea that the battle for the head of the DNC is going to be between Howard Dean and Keith Ellison.
My understanding is it's Ellison. Schumer already endorsed
Yeah,
Ellison.
I mean, I don't know what Dean was doing, but this is just a point sort of to remind viewers that Howard Dean, among other things in his post-electoral life, has been a shill for an Iranian cult come resistance group called the MEK. So you, just because you have never heard of any of these folks in the context of national security policy does not mean that they don't come in with some really interesting views. Ellison, by the way, I've worked with a bit in the past, and I find him very impressive. No,
I mean, I'm sure you've seen this tweet that's gone viral, which is when Ellison back in the summer of 2015 said, I think Donald Trump's going to be the GOP nominee, and like everyone else around the ABC This Week or whatever roundtable was laughing at him. I've seen that God knows how many times over the last 48 hours.
No, and Ellison's one of these people who, because he's a fantastic natural politician, his instincts on international issues are also pretty sound. Because he sort of is a person who is able to look at a situation and say, okay, what are the power dynamics here, and how are people going to respond to each other? So sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was also going to say last point on Schumer, which is you're correct on talking about national security. I think the other interesting thing is that on foreign economic policy, Schumer is going to be a little more simpatico with Trump than people realize. I mean, Schumer is, kind of a protectionist when it comes to trade. I mean, he wanted to pass that bill punishing China for currency manipulation back in the first term of Obama. So it would not surprise me. And then, of course, Schumer has a long history with Trump. So it wouldn't surprise me if there's somewhat more Senate comity between the Democrats and Trump than we would have expected ex ante.
That's a very interesting dilemma for Mitch McConnell, who doesn't really have any good fellowship with Trump to spare, and who has been, I mean, look, Mitch McConnell's not ever effusive about anything, but compared with sort of Ryan's post-election statements, McConnell, that's going to be a very interesting, and honestly, McConnell's going to have a rough ride because 51-49 is a very small majority in the Senate. Mm-hmm. So in fact.
I don't even know the final numbers on the House. Did the Republicans lose seats in the House, or did they gain?
The last I saw, they lost 8.
Right. I mean, which again, they still have a majority, but it's worth remembering that they actually are going to be weaker after this election than before.
Right. And again,
at least in Congress,
though the two Senate seats that were lost, it's interesting. Mark Kirk and Kelly Ayotte were very full-throated interventionists on international issues, but on domestic issues, they were two of the less hardline.
Yes.
They were two of the less hardline Republicans. So it's an interesting mixed bag.
Yeah, and to be fair, someone like Ayotte, who you might disagree with, actually did care about foreign policy. Again, there's always two dimensions here, I think, you need to talk about, which is the hawkish, dovish one, and then whether they actually care about this stuff or not.
Right. So, just the last thing I want to say here is that it's very easy at this moment to say, Republicans hold all 3 houses, this is going to be boring and awful. But in fact, just in the course of this conversation, there's just huge divisions on international issues. I think you and I should, in a month, maybe do a whole show on trade. I don't feel like we know enough to talk about it yet, but boy, that's going to be fascinating.
Yes, it will be. Which I think actually gives rise to the last thing you wanted to talk about, which is the question of whether the ethics of serving in a Trump administration if you were a Republican who was opposed to Donald Trump.
Yeah, I mean, we've given viewers quite a lot on that already, and I mean, as I said, there is this just intense and really painful set of conversations going on the Democratic side right now about how much loyalty do we as citizens owe to somebody who spent so much of his campaign appearing to advocate illegal and deeply ethically problematic things. So I want to, rather than appearing to gloat over this dilemma as an outsider, I want to say that I feel like we're all of us who all of us who thought that Trump meant at least some of what he said are struggling with some version of this dilemma at this point, that what is citizenship?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I hate to do this. I'm going to quote Peter Thiel, which is, I think there's two issues going on here. The first is, as Peter Thiel pointed out, I think in the end correctly, that the thing about Trump is that when the media reported Trump, took his words literally but not substantively, whereas Trump supporters took his words substantively but not literally, if that makes sense, which is that the media tended to focus on the things he actually said without thinking about what the philosophy was behind them, whereas potentially the voters didn't take what he said literally but understood the message he was trying to send. And I think to some extent the question that, going forward, that Republicans who are interested in, public service and interested in advancing the American interest but nonetheless have serious qualms about Donald Trump and the way he went about it during the campaign, need to ask themselves, what is the best way, can they serve in a Trump administration and still look at themselves in the mirror in the morning? And I think in the end, it really is legitimately going to come down to who they wind up appointing at the cabinet level. Because I do think they can send a signal one way or the other in terms of how much of Trump's rhetoric was just rhetoric, and how much does he actually intend to pursue. There's a lot of reasons why people would want to serve an administration. There's obviously individual career ambitions. There's, again, the fact that you really believe in this. There's the fact that you want to get some experience because, as you say, it's in everyone's interest for both parties to have a deep national security bench. But I think the jury is still out, and I think we're going to have to talk a month from now about, presumably by that point we should have a better sense of who Trump's, national security cabinet is going to look like, and what does that mean?
Well, I don't think Peter Thiel was. I thought it was Yair Rosenberg who said that, but I agree with it.
I thought it was Peter Thiel, but okay.
I agree with it as a critique of the media. At the same time, the KKK folks who want to have a victory rally in North Carolina, and the stories you're seeing all over the place about, actually a friend of a friend had to go get her son out of school because other kids in the school were saying, Trump won, we can lynch you now. The sort of cutesy formulation that you quoted doesn't take into account the really real impact, both here and around the world, of what was said. I'm going to a solidarity rally at a mosque this afternoon, at which I understand there will be local Republican officials present, as well as the Attorney General of Virginia, which is a great thing. And I keep hoping, and this would be, my request of anybody who is going to serve, and I certainly understand why somebody would, is really, take some affirmative steps to heal and reassure and reach out to your fellow citizens who are, however the rhetoric was meant, it is having real negative consequences in the lives of our fellow citizens. And that's, just as we should care and we should be visibly doing more than we were for our fellow citizens who feel left behind and express that by voting for Trump, the obverse is also true. And I keep hoping to see, more Republicans of goodwill taking a page from George W. Bush, frankly, and really reaching out to the communities that are most. This is
one of Bush's best qualities as president.
It is. And I mean, actually, I'd love to see him out there doing this. I mean, I know he's been, very reticent in his post-presidential life, but this would actually be a real role he could take on now. So with that,
on that note,
happy Thanksgiving, everyone. May you have many things to be thankful for, and we will see you in a month.
Take care.
Bye.